At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 216, and if you could move to page 2, calling out the definition of deadly force. And, sir, could you read into the record for the jury what the definition of deadly force is, beginning at force which the actor uses?
Yes. Force which the actor uses with the purpose of causing or which the actor should reasonably know creates a substantial risk of causing death of great bodily harm.
I'd like to now republish Exhibit 254, the composite. And this is the force applied. I'm going to ask you, sir, do you have an opinion to a degree of reasonable professional certainty whether the force used, as shown in Exhibit 254, whether that force being applied then for the restraint period, which you've defined as 9 minutes and 29 seconds, would constitute deadly force?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
That it would.
Why is that?
Because at the time of the restraint period, Mr. Floyd was not resisting. He was in the prone position. He was handcuffed. He was not attempting to evade. He was not attempting to resist. And the pressure that was being caused by the body weight could cause positional asphyxia, which could cause death.
Is positional asphyxia a known risk in law enforcement?
Yes, it is.
How long have the dangers of positional asphyxia been known?
At least 20 years. I can recall a Department of Justice memo from, I believe, 1995 that discussed it, and I know that I was trained on it in 1995 as well.
And the risk or the danger of positional asphyxia, the worst outcome is death, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And when we talk about positional asphyxia and the risk, is that risk increased with the increase of pressure on the subject?
Yes, so positional asphyxia can occur even if there is no pressure, no body weight on a subject. Just being in that position, and especially being handcuffed, creates a situation where the person has a difficult time breathing, which could cause death. When you add body weight to that, then it just increases the possibility of death.
And what additional weight did you see in your analysis here?
The defendant's body weight, as well as the two other individuals, the two other officers.
One of the other officers appeared to be pressing down on Mr. Floyd?
Yes.
Was that Officer King?
Yes.
And what was Officer Lane doing?
He was holding his legs.
You can take that down, please. Sir, in applying the rules of use of force and use of reasonable force, it's the officer has to consider the totality of circumstances. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And one of the circumstances can be the location. That could be important. Is that right?
Yes.
And are you aware that there was a group of bystanders who eventually began to watch the defendant and the other officers use force on Mr. Floyd?
Yes.
Now, sir, in your experience with the Los Angeles Police Department and in the areas you were patrolling, have you ever had to use force or apply force or handcuff a suspect in the view of bystanders?
Yes, sir.
Have you ever had to handcuff an unwilling suspect or subject in the view of bystanders?
Yes, sir.
Have you ever had to do so in the presence of a hostile crowd?
Yes, sir.
Could you define a hostile crowd in that context?
I would define hostile crowd in the situations I've been in where the crowd or members of the crowd were threatening and or throwing bottles and rocks at us, at the police.
Have you had that experience?
Yes, sir.
On more than one occasion?
Yes.
Okay. So if I could publish Exhibit 184, and getting back to the circumstances of this case, this appear to be the bystanders that were gathered watching the defendant apply force to Mr. Floyd.
Yes, it does.
When you reviewed the body-worn cameras, did you see anybody throw any rocks or bottles?
No, I did not.
Did you see anyone physically attack the officers?
No, I did not.
Did you hear foul language or name calling?
There was some name calling, yes, but and some foul language, but that was about the most of it.
Did that factor into your analysis?
No,
Why not?
because I did not perceive them as being a threat.
And why is that?
Because they were merely filming, and most of it was their concern for Mr. Floyd.
And in terms of proportionality in the force continuum, is the officer able to increase the use of force on an individual based on the conduct of some third party over whom the subject has no control?
No, the officers can only use force based on the subject's actions.
Do you acknowledge that loud noise and name calling can in fact be distracting?
Yes, it can be.
What does an experienced and trained officer do in the face of that sort of distraction?
They continue to assess and reassess their force, or they would attempt to lower any type of threat level that they may perceive.
Now, based on your review of the offense materials and the records, as of May 25, 2020, how long had the defendant been a Minneapolis police officer?
Approximately 19 years.
And if we can call out, publish Exhibit 203, and if you could highlight the top portion. These appear to be workforce training records of the defendant, is that right?
Yes.
And it indicates approximately 866 hours
Yes.
of paid training.
Yes.
Do you think that should have been sufficient training to prepare the defendant for this distraction?
Absolutely.
You take that down, please. Now, sir, but you do acknowledge that it would be possible for a loud group, to distract a defendant from being attentive to George Floyd. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you believe that occurred?
No, I do not.
Why is that?
Because in the body-worn video, you can hear Mr. Floyd displaying his discomfort and pain, and you can also hear the defendant responding to him.
Now, at this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 47 and bring us to the body. That's the body-worn camera footage of Lane. Bring us to the point of 20, 22, and 23 seconds. Okay. And at this time, I'd like to publish that and play that section for the jury.
My stomach hurts. My neck hurts. Everything hurts. There's water or something. Please. Please. I can't breathe, officer.
It's talking, it's not
They
yelling.
will kill me. They will kill me, man.
It's a heck of a lot of oxygen.
Come on, man.
All right. Is that the exchange that you testified to of the defendant responding to statements of Mr. Floyd?
Yes, sir.
And sir, approximately how long did the defendant continue to restrain George Floyd after the exchange we just heard?
I believe 6 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Nelson.
I may have just a moment to get set up, Your Honor. Morning, Sergeant Steiger.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here. Did you enjoy the rain last night?
Yes.
A little different than California, right?
Yes, we don't get that much.
Sergeant, I have a few questions first and foremost about your experience. Have you ever previously testified in any court or in any state or in federal court as an expert on the police use of force?
No, I have not.
Have you ever been qualified by any court of competent jurisdiction on as an expert in the use of police force?
Yes.
Where?
In Los Angeles during a trial of use of force that I was the investigator for.
Okay. Is that the only time in that case?
Yes.
And you are here in your own personal capacity, correct?
Yes, sir.
You are not here as a representative of either the Los Angeles Police Department or the Office of Inspector General, correct?
Correct.
The training that you've experienced and that you have conducted, that has all been by the Los Angeles Police Department, correct?
No.
So the training you received to become a police officer, it's primarily conducted by the Los Angeles Police Department, correct?
Yes.
You may have gone to some outside vendor training, but those vendors had to be approved by the Los Angeles Police Department, correct?
Yes.
Meaning the training that you attended outside of LAPD stuff would have to be consistent with Los Angeles Police Department's policies.
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
They have to be in compliance with California Post.
Okay. Now, you would agree that the policies of the Los Angeles Police Department are their policies, correct?
Correct.
And the policies of every police department are going to be different to some degree.
To some degree, yes.
And some police departments may authorize a particular form of force while others don't, correct?
To a certain extent, yes.
And that is a question of the reasonableness of that type of force. One department may say this is not a reasonable use of force, and another department may say this is a reasonable use of force.
Based on my training experience, every agency that I've seen based their use of force policy on Graham versus Connor, so it's pretty standard.
Right. But in terms of the actual tactics of the use of force, right? So a department may authorize the use of a particular tool, and another department may not authorize that tool.
Correct.
And thus they're both uses of force or potential uses of force, and the instruments to use that force may be different.
Yes, but they all have to fall into the objective reasonableness standard.
Understood. But one department could determine that that type of an instrument or that technique is within the reasonableness, objective reasonableness standard, while another department may not.
Correct.
So there can be, it's another way of saying reasonable minds can differ.
Correct.
Now, you testified that you have been a trainer for the Los Angeles Police Department in terms of their tactics, correct?
Yes, sir.
So when you talk about your training experience, are you doing it from like a teacher, you're teaching, lecturing, that type of standpoint, or are you doing the training on the mats, training the techniques, or both?
Both.
You've never been trained by the Minneapolis Police Department, correct?
No, I have not.
All right. But upon being hired in this case, you received a lot of materials in this case, right?
Yes, I did.
You received an extensive amount of Minneapolis Police Department training materials, right?
Yes.
And you received investigative reports, right?
Yes.
From the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, correct?
Yes.
And you received video cameras, correct? Or videotapes, correct?
Yes.
And you received materials within the training materials that also contained like videos or examples and illustrative type of materials as a part of the training materials, right?
I don't quite understand.
Well, let me rephrase it. Sometimes in a PowerPoint presentation, there may be a video embedded in that PowerPoint presentation. And that video is an example of a specific move, or it may be training exercises, or these scenario-based trainings. Did you see all of those?
No, I did not. I wasn't able to because most of the PowerPoint presentations were in a PDF form, so I was not able to view the videos.
Okay. So you've not seen the training videos prepared by the Minneapolis Police Department?
No.
But all of this material that you have received is, in fact, what you used in part to form your opinions in this case, right?
Yes, sir.
You relied on those materials to a certain extent.
Yes.
And some of those materials were completely irrelevant to this case, agreed?
Yes.
Such as the use of the taser, right?
Yes.
Such as the mounted patrol unit, right?
Yes.
But you received other information that was informative and had an effect on your analysis in this case, agreed?
Yes.
So those training materials were an important part of how you came to form your opinion.
Yes.
Now, you ultimately prepared a written report, correct?
Yes, I did.
And in your written report, you detailed your opinions and findings on the case, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you also made an exhibit of the materials that you reviewed, right?
Yes.
Now, would you agree that your report in total is 461 pages,
Yes.
right? I have it here, right? 461 pages.
Yes.
Of the 461 pages, 26 pages constitute your opinions, right?
Correct.
And from page 27 to 461, this is a list of the materials that you reviewed in preparation of this case,
That I received.
that you received.
Yes.
And you reviewed some, but not all of these materials.
Correct.
All right. Ultimately, what you concluded that you received a total of 5,737 different training materials or items to review.
I don't know the exact number, but
If the last number in your list is 5,737, would you dispute that?
well, I would have to look at it, but yeah, I
Wouldn't disagree.
wouldn't disagree.
All right. In addition to your analysis, you're using and relying on your own training, right?
Yes.
Your own experience as a police officer, right?
Correct.
Your experiences doing both peer review of use of force with the Los Angeles Police Department and your investigation of uses of force, correct?
Correct.
And you ultimately submitted your report to the state of Minnesota on January 31st of this year, correct?
I believe so. Yes, that's correct.
Since you have submitted your report, have you received any additional information, investigative or otherwise, about this case?
No.
So any training materials that came to us subsequent to January 31st, any investigative information that was received, you've not had an opportunity to review that, right?
Correct.
Since submitting your report, it's fair to say that you've also had several conversations with prosecutors in connection with this case, correct?
Correct.
I believe that you met with prosecutors or conversed with prosecutors on February 1st of this year, March 3rd of this year, March 11th of this year, and April 3rd of this year. Would you dispute me if I told you that those were the dates?
I mean, I would have to look at my calendar, but no, I believe that's correct.
Your Honor, do we have a quick sidebar?
So I guess in addition, you had an additional meeting with prosecutors after court last night?
Excuse me?
In addition to the dates I've already referenced, you had some additional trial preparation yesterday with the prosecution, right? After your testimony?
No, we had a brief conversation, but no trial prep.
Okay. You and I have never met or spoke, right?
Correct.
But you're aware that prosecutors give me summaries of those meetings?
Yes.
So you also testified yesterday that in your role with the Los Angeles Police Department and the Office of Inspector
General.
Inspector General, thank you. You've reviewed thousands of use of force cases, right?
Yes.
And it's fair to say that those cases range in terms of the use of force, right? The types of force used are very variable.
Correct.
Some cases may involve whether an officer should have punched a person, right?
Correct.
Some may involve whether they should have used a particular technique or not, a taser, for example.
Correct.
Some involve the use of deadly force, correct?
Correct.
But they're not all, these thousands of cases are not all deadly force or resulting in the death of an individual, right?
Correct.
And in fact, the vast majority of these are based upon like civilian complaints, perhaps, or sergeant's review of a use of force, right?
Sergeant's review, a sergeant's investigation, yes.
Right.
Not civilian complaints, but primarily as our sergeant's investigation.
So in the Los Angeles Police Department, it's similar to the Minneapolis Police Department. If an officer uses force, there are certain types of force they have to report to their superior, correct?
Correct.
And then the superior, the sergeant, will review and investigate that use of force, correct?
Correct.
And then that process, from once that report is completed, you were on the panel of people that reviewed that investigation.
On certain occasions, yes.
So again, I mean, in your capacity of reviewing the use of force, you would agree that Graham versus Connor is the standard,
Correct.
right? It is the universal standard for all police officers in the United States, right?
To my knowledge, yes.
And that's because it comes from the United States Supreme Court, right?
Yes.
Kind of the highest law making or the highest court in the land, right?
Correct.
And that's the standard that the Office of Inspector General uses,
It uses the Los Angeles Police Department's use of force policy.
which also includes the Graham versus Connor standard.
Correct.
Now, in terms of Minneapolis, that's the same standard we use here.
Yes, it is.
Right. And that's embodied in the Minneapolis Police Department's use of force policy 5-303, correct?
I don't know the exact number, but yes, I believe so.
Now, the Graham versus Connor factor, if I just may have a second. You've talked yesterday and today about the Graham v. Connor factors, and you've done thousands of use of force reviews. You're comfortable discussing Graham versus Connor?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I'd ask the...
Sure.
So again, you've reviewed the Minneapolis Police Department policy that incorporates Graham versus Connor, correct?
Correct.
And within the Minneapolis Police Department policy, I'd ask the court to, I would like you to publish Exhibit 106. I have 106 up. there is, at Exhibit 106, there is the incorporation of Graham versus Connor.
Yes.
All right. Now, the authorized use of force in the state of Minnesota exists primarily from a state statute, correct?
Yes.
And then that state statute, in terms of the police department policy, has to be consistent with the Graham versus Connor factors, right?
Correct.
And it's fair to say that there's more to the analysis of Graham versus Connor than simply the severity of the crime, the immediacy of the threat, or the act of resistance, right?
Yes.
In fact, what the ultimate police department policy says here is because the test of reasonableness under the Fourth Amendment is not capable of precise definition or mechanical application, its proper application requires careful attention to the facts and circumstances of each particular case, including those three factors.
Correct.
Right? Not limited to those three factors, though.
Correct.
After we discuss those, after the policy discusses those three factors, the policy goes on to read that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of the reasonable officer, correct?
Correct.
On the scene, correct?
Correct.
Rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight, right?
Right.
And the reason that becomes important is this next paragraph, which reads, the calculus of reasonableness must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation. Agreed? That's what it
That's
says?
what it says. Yes, you're correct.
And this is the Minneapolis Police Department policy. Right?
Correct.
And then it concludes by saying that the authorized use of force requires careful attention to the facts and circumstances of each case. Agreed?
Correct.
All right. So ultimately, the analysis of the objective reasonableness of any case has to be a consideration of all of these thoughts that are contained within the policy.
If they apply, yes.
And this is not an exclusive list of factors that apply, right?
Correct.
Because ultimately, it's what's called the totality of the
circumstances.
circumstances
Yes.
event, right?
Yes.
So we have to look at the entirety of everything that's going on, right?
Yes, we have to look at the subject's actions as well as the officer's actions. And typically during my analysis, I look at the actions before, during, and after, what the officer knew at the time, and things of that nature.
And sometimes the use of force is instantaneous, right?
Sometimes, but not in this case. I didn't believe so.
Understood. But sometimes the use of force is instantaneous.
Sometimes, correct.
Right. I shoot a gun, that's a very fast action, right?
Correct.
I punch you in the face, that's a quicker type of a reaction.
Correct.
I tase you, it's a quicker reaction. It's just inherently a fast action.
In some cases, correct.
And ultimately, one of the things you said yesterday was that you concluded that this was an excessive use of force, right?
Yes.
That's not the standard, is it? The question is whether it is an objectively reasonable use of force, right?
Correct.
Now, when we review an authorized or whether a use of force is authorized, there are sort of layers to that analysis. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
All right. And I'm going to kind of start from the out and then work my way in. There's the general training that an officer has and his experience or her experience, right?
Yes.
There is kind of a mid-level of surrounding circumstances, right? Like, what do we know about the geography? What do we know about the neighborhood? What do we know about the people involved, right?
Yes.
And then there's the direct kind of layer, which is what's the type of force being used? How long is it being used? What are the subject and the officer's actions and reactions, right?
Yes. Seriousness of crime, things of that nature. Yes.
Yep. So Under the reasonable officer standard, we have to take into consideration the officer's training, right?
Yes.
We have to take into account his or her personal experience, right?
Yes.
We have to take into account tactical advantages or disadvantages, right?
Correct.
We have to take into account scene security.
Yes.
We have to take into account the safety and security of our police, our partners, right?
Yes.
We have to take into account the public's safety, right?
Yes.
We have to take into account the location, generally speaking. Is this a high crime, moderate crime, or low crime area, right? We
Yes.
take that into account. We have to take into account the specific location, meaning, am I in a middle of a busy intersection where buses and cars are driving by, or am I in someone's yard, backyard, right?
Yes.
We have to take into account de-escalation possibilities, right?
Yes.
So you've seen, and you discussed a little bit yesterday, the Minneapolis Police Department, I'm sorry, we can take this down. The Minneapolis Police Department's critical decision-making model, right?
I don't believe we discussed that yesterday.
But you reviewed that,
Yes.
and you understand that what an officer is supposed to do is kind of go through this cycle process, taking in information, right?
Yes.
Assessing the risk, the threat, deciding, is it lawful for me to do this? How do I react? Ultimately with the goal of keeping everybody safe, right?
Yes, that's a pretty standard thing to continually reassess as you are using force.
Right. Reassessment is a specific tool,
Yes.
and that's common to police officers, right?
Yes, sir.
You have to take into account that sometimes incidents or interactions with a citizen are benign at best, right? They're not risky in any sense.
Correct.
But that not risky situation can very quickly become a very risky situation. Agreed?
Agreed.
And there are certain circumstances that officers, they walk into knowing that this could be a higher risk situation, right?
Yes, depending on the nature of the call, things of that nature.
Right. So, for example, domestic assault calls have a high risk, right, to an officer.
Yes, just like a robbery or
Just like a robbery,
Shooting.
a shooting. Lots of situations that officers are expected to go into, they go into with a heightened sense of awareness. Agreed?
correct.
And sometimes an officer will walk into a situation, have no sense of risk or no sense of concern, but they have to prepare for the unexpected. Agreed?
I wouldn't agree with that. I believe, based on my training and experience, most officers, once we put that uniform on and we respond to a call, we know that there's a risk factor. We just don't know what level, depending on the severity of the severity of the call.
Right. So every single time an officer responds to a call, there is an inherent risk.
Correct.
Right? That's the nature of policing. Right?
Yes, it is.
And an officer, a reasonable officer, has to be prepared for that risk level to change.
Correct. That's where we use tactics.
Now, again, one of the things that officers have to take into consideration is their department's policies, right?
Yes.
And you would agree, would you not, that every single use of force policy that Minneapolis has some form of what's called a qualifier, meaning if it's reasonable, or if it's safe, or if it's tactically proper, right?
Yes.
So all of the analysis has to depend upon the safety, the practicality, and in certain circumstances, tactics, right?
In certain circumstances, yes.
Right.
In most cases, the objective reasonableness of the actual force being used.
Right. And when we look at the use of force, we don't look at the use of force in a vacuum, do we?
No, we do not. We should not. I've seen some agencies, that's all they focus on is the actual use of force. But when I do my analysis, I look at the totality of the circumstances, meaning I look at the officer's tactics as well as the subject's actions during the whole entire incident.
Right. And because it's a totality of the circumstances analysis, we need to, and it's objectively reasonable based on the facts of this particular case, correct?
Correct.
And so we need to look very closely at all of the facts in assessing whether or not the use of force was reasonable. Agreed?
Agreed.
So let's talk about the facts of this case. Do you understand that Officer Chauvin was the initial officer dispatched to this call?
Yes.
And that dispatch ultimately, what's called the sector car, took over the call, and Officer Chauvin was no longer responding, right?
Correct. He was no longer the primary unit.
Right. It's reasonable for a police officer to rely upon information he or she receives from dispatch, correct?
Correct.
And so you understand that in this particular case, dispatch advised the officers that the suspect was still on scene, correct?
Correct.
That it was a priority 1 response call, correct?
Correct.
That means get there quick, right? That's code 3, get there with lights and sirens, right?
I don't know the exact code for Minneapolis PD, but I believe you.
Okay. And that the suspect was 6 to 6.5 feet tall, right?
Yes.
And that he was possibly under the influence,
Correct.
right? So it's reasonable for an officer to rely upon that information in response to a call, right?
Yes.
And
So they can confirm it.
they can confirm it, but it also sets the stage, right? We're talking about the inherent risks, right?
Yes.
So it's much different how a reasonable police officer would respond to an intoxicated, large person versus a smaller person who's just a little crabby, right?
In some cases, yes. I've seen small people put up bigger fights than bigger people.
So it's reasonable for a police officer to be in a heightened sense of awareness based upon the information they receive from dispatch. Agreed?
Agreed.
Now, ultimately, you understand that under the facts of this case, Officer Chauvin was dispatched a second time, correct?
Correct.
And that's because the dispatcher heard that officers were taking someone out of the car, right?
Yes.
And so let's just kind of stop there for a second. When you consider the fact that this was a forgery or a counterfeiting call, and you don't expect to use force in that type of a situation, you wouldn't normally expect.
Correct.
But now you hear dispatch send you on an emergency basis to the scene because officers are using force, right? They took somebody out of the car.
Taking someone out of the car is not necessarily a use of force.
Have you listened to the dispatch of this, the audio of the dispatch of this case?
I believe so.
And the testimony
ago.
of the 911 operator was that she heard screaming and scuffling or some sort of a noise that prompted her to dispatch a second car, right?
I didn't hear her testimony.
Okay. But officers, they get the radio traffic, right?
Yes.
They do hear all of the communication amongst all of the officers, right?
Correct.
And it's reasonable for an officer to rely on that information, right?
Yes.
And if you are an officer and you hear a scuffle on the radio, you hear we're taking one out, and you get dispatched code 3 or in an emergent situation, it's reasonable for an officer to come in with a heightened sense of alertness and awareness.
Absolutely.
And you would expect that, right?
Yes.
You've responded to these calls, I'm sure, thousands of times, right?
Yes.
So now you have an officer, a reasonable officer, would have a heightened sense of concern about this call.
Correct.
So when Officer Chauvin arrived at 8:17 and 23 seconds, he knew that some degree of force was being used because of what he heard on the dispatch, presumably, correct?
Correct.
He knew that other officers were there, right?
Yes.
He knew that he was being dispatched to back up a situation, right?
Yes.
He knew that the individual suspect was possibly impaired, right?
Yes.
Based on the dispatch. And he knew that he was 6 to 6 feet tall. 6 to 6.5 feet tall.
Yes.
And so when Officer Chauvin arrived on scene, he had a certain amount of information that a reasonable police officer can rely on in forming his or her next steps, right?
Yes.
And when he arrived, he observed Mr. Floyd and 2 officers, correct?
Correct.
At the back seat of a squad car, correct?
Correct.
And what you described as Mr. Floyd actively resisting their attempts to put him into the back seat of the squad car.
Yes.
At that point, according to the model, the use of force continuum, Officer Chauvin, theoretically, based on what he saw, active resistance, he could have come up and dry stunned him or tased him. That would be within the active resistance, struggling use of force continuum.
Yes.
He didn't do that, right?
No, he did not.
Because sometimes an officer has to back down in their use of force, right?
In certain situations, yes.
A reasonable officer who comes on scene based with all of the information that he has at that particular time, right, comes into the scene, sees 2 other police officers struggling with an actively resisting person, right? It's reasonable for that officer to assist his fellow officers in their efforts, right?
Correct.
And you observed the body camera footage of the struggle, right?
Yes, I did.
And you would agree that from the time Officer Chauvin gets on scene into the time that Mr. Floyd is proned on the ground, Mr. Floyd was actively resisting efforts to go into the backseat of the squad car.
Yes, sir.
And the officers were reasonable in their use of force in their attempt to get him into the back of the squad car. Agreed?
Agreed.
Now, in this context, Mr. Floyd was saying certain things as he was being attempted to be put into the back of the squad car, right?
Yes.
You recall him at that point saying things like, "I'm not a bad guy."
Yes.
Do you remember him saying, "I have COVID,"
Yes.
or "I just got
I
over
just
the
got
COVID"?
COVID. Yes.
Do you remember him saying at that point, "I can't breathe"?
Yes.
He was saying to the police officers at that point, "I can't breathe,"
Yes.
as he was actively resisting their efforts to put him into the squad car.
Yes.
Now, again, in the course of your career and in the course of your training, experience, and all of the contexts that you've done, have you ever had somebody say to you, to attempt to bargain with you to avoid being arrested?
Yes.
Sort of like, "Hey man, I'll do what you want as long as I don't have to go to jail," right?
Yes.
Or somebody may be fighting and they may agree to stop fighting with you through a bargaining process, right? Saying, "If I get to sit on the curb, I will stop fighting."
Yes. In certain instances, yes.
Right. Have you ever had a person feign a physical ailment as you attempted to arrest them?
Yes.
Sometimes people will say, "I'm having a heart attack," right? "I think I'm having a heart attack. Don't take me to jail. Take me to the hospital."
Yes.
Right? And it's fair to say that the vast majority, well, I shouldn't say the vast majority, it's fair to say that one of the things that an officer has to do in the assessment of the reasonableness of his use of force is take into consideration what the suspect is saying and how he's acting.
Yes. 100%.
Right? So if somebody is saying, "I can't breathe," and they're passing out and they're not resisting, that's one form of an analysis, right?
Yes.
Because the actions of the suspect are consistent with the verbal utterances he's making, right?
Yes.
Other times, and in this particular case, when Mr. Floyd was initially saying that he couldn't breathe, he was actively resisting arrest.
Initially, when he was in the backseat of the vehicle, yes.
And in fact, he was using his legs to push back and to use his body weight to against the officers, right?
Yes.
And at one point, 3 Minneapolis police officers were attempting to get him into the backseat of the squad car from the passenger side of the car, correct?
Correct.
And they were not able to do so.
No.
And in your report, you described it as when the futility of their efforts became clear, I think was the term you used.
I can't recall using that word, but maybe I did.
All right. Would you disagree? Would it refresh your recollection to review your report?
Yes, absolutely.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
Does that refresh your recollection, sir?
Yes, it does.
And what you wrote was, when the futility of the 3 officers continuing their efforts forcibly to seat Floyd in the squad's backseat became clear, right?
Yes.
They put him on the ground in the prone position, right?
Yes.
So again, just in this context of assessing what someone is saying, a subject, an arrestee is saying, in comparison to their actions, you're also making assessments of their physical characteristics, right? An officer should be observing what physical characteristics a person is displaying. Agreed?
Yes.
So, and you're analyzing that against what a person says, right? Or
Correct.
how they're acting, I should say. So, somebody, if you ask, are you consuming, what did you take? What drugs are you on? And they deny that they're on drugs, but there's physical evidence to suggest to the contrary. It's a consideration an officer has to make, right?
Yes.
And in this case, officers asked Mr. Floyd repeatedly what kind of drugs he was using, right?
Yes.
You've had an opportunity to review the body-worn cameras, and you've seen sort of a white substance forming around Mr. Floyd's mouth.
Yes.
That would be consistent in your experience with someone who's possibly using controlled substances?
Correct.
Is it common in your experience for people who have been using drugs or alcohol to deny that they have used drugs or alcohol?
Yes, in some instances, yes.
Right. It's kind of the proverbial drunk driver, right? I haven't had anything, officer, right?
Yes.
I've had 2 beers, right? People have a tendency to minimize what they have consumed, right?
Yes.
Now, you have testified, as I understand your testimony, that once that the officers putting Mr. Floyd into the prone position was initially a reasonable use of force, right?
Yes.
And you're familiar with the swarm technique,
Yes.
where multiple officers are on top of a resisting suspect trying to control the extremities, right?
Yes. Typically that's done prior to handcuffing.
But that's once you're putting someone once someone is handcuffed, right, and they're in the ground, a person who's in handcuffs can continue to be a threat. Agreed?
Yes.
They can kick you.
Correct.
They could bite you.
Correct.
They could thrash and get free and start running, right?
In certain instances, yes.
And in certain instances, they can even get your weapon, right?
Yes.
They could get your gun from you, even though they're handcuffed.
Yes.
So the notion that a handcuffed suspect no longer presents a threat to an officer is not correct.
It depends on the circumstances.
Right. A handcuffed suspect can continue to present a risk.
Based on that person's actions, yes.
Right. And so once you're have a suspect in the prone position and they continue to kick, it may require more force than if they were compliant, right?
Yes. That's why we have devices like the hobble.
Right. Now, initially during this instance, you would agree that Mr. Floyd continued to make certain protestations about his inability to breathe, right?
Yes.
And he was saying lots of other things like that he was in pain and that he was hurting, correct?
Correct.
And an officer, a reasonable officer, they need to communicate with each other, right?
Yes.
A reasonable officer is going to rely on information that his fellow officer tells him, right?
Yes.
A reasonable officer, again, is going to take into consideration what the suspect is saying, right?
Yes.
And compare that against the actions, right?
Yes.
And at a point during the exchange, initially, officers are going to kind of talk and figure out what's going to happen next, right?
They should, yes.
What has just happened, right? Why are we involved here? What's next? And you can sometimes take time to formulate options and decisions, right?
Yes.
In the scene of an arrest, even just in the immediate kind of wingspan, that can be very chaotic, right?
Yes.
People can be talking to each other. People can be talking over each other, right?
Yes.
The suspect may be saying some things, right?
Yes.
Bystanders may be saying some things, right?
Yes.
In the chaos, it's easy to miss some things, right?
In certain instances, yes,
Right.
depending on the severity of what's going on.
I'd like to publish part of the body-worn camera. It's Officer King's body-worn camera, starting at 2021-01.
This is a portion of what's already been received.
Yes.
Any objection?
No objection.
I'd like you to see if you can tell me what Mr. Floyd says in this instance.
I ain't keeping this real on his
Mercedes.
Please. I ain't keeping this real on his
Mercedes.
Please.
You hear what he said?
No, I couldn't make it out.
Does it sound like he says, I ate too many drugs? Listen again.
I ain't keeping this real on his
Mercedes.
Please.
I can't make that out, no.
So in the chaos of a situation, things can be missed, right?
Yes.
You would agree that at one point during the exchange, Mr. Floyd was advised that he was under arrest, right?
Yes.
In fact, that happened a couple of times, right?
Yes.
Now, at the point they have Mr. Floyd on the ground, you would agree and you're aware that officers called for EMS, right?
Yes.
It's reasonable for an officer to call EMS, right?
Yes.
Depend if there is an injury, right? Or some need.
Or a complaint of injury or some discomfort or medical emergency, yes.
And you understand that in this particular instance, very shortly after Mr. Floyd was on the ground, officers called for EMS.
Yes.
They called for
initially for his injury to his head.
to his face or mouth
Yes.
injury, right? And they called it they called EMS in a non-emergent situation, right?
Correct.
And that happened at 8:19 and 49 seconds. Code 2 EMS for a mouth injury, right?
Yes.
And this occurred at the point when officers were discussing whether or not to use the hobble restraint on Mr. Floyd, right?
Yes.
And ultimately, officers did not use the hobble restraint, right?
Correct.
A hobble restraint would generally require officers to consider calling EMS, right? According to Minneapolis Police
Yes.
Department policy.
According to Minneapolis Police Department.
And may be different in other jurisdictions, right?
Correct.
So as officers are discussing and ultimately they decide, you agree, that they decide not to use the hobble device.
Yes, they did not use the hobble device.
And we talked a little bit earlier about the de-escalation component of things, right?
Yes.
A decision to use or to not use a higher form of force that you may have been authorized to use can actually be a de-escalation technique. Agreed?
In certain instances, yes.
Right. So officers making a decision not to increase the level of force can be viewed as a de-escalation technique.
Yes.
Now, again, we've talked a lot about the need for reassessment and kind of things as they reassessment, and officers need to continue to take in information, process it, figure things out, right?
Yes.
They have to, as a part of that process, continue to attempt to de-escalate, right?
Yes.
Would you agree that an officer saying things like relax, take a deep breath, that's a way of trying to calm somebody, right?
Yes, if it's not going with other actions. I mean, you can say relax, calm down, but if you're punching somebody, that's not going to let someone relax and calm down.
Right. But if you have someone restrained and they're complaining, I can't breathe, but they're speaking, they're still moving, they're still talking, you may say, hey man, relax, calm down, take a deep breath, right? We're going to
Yes.
be, right? As a way of reassuring that person, we've gotcha, right?
Yes, that you're listening or you can understand what they're trying to communicate to you.
And ultimately, again, officers in this reassessment process, in this case, reassessed the need for a quicker EMS response, right?
Yes, after I believe their initial call for the injury, then they asked for a quicker response.
Right. It's stepping it up, I guess, is the quote,
Yes.
right? They increased the priority of the call from a code 2 to a code 3, which in Minneapolis means get here with your lights and sirens, right?
Yes.
As a part of your analysis, again, at any level, did you consider what the average 911 or EMS response time is?
Yes.
Do you have that information?
Not for Minneapolis, no, but I know just on average, typically, usually it's between like 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay. And that's not specific to Minneapolis, right?
Correct.
And it obviously depends upon certain circumstances, right?
Correct.
If there's say a firehouse 3 blocks away, it may be 90 seconds or
Correct.
a minute even, right?
Correct.
And sometimes if all of the ambulances are busy
Right.
and all of the fire trucks are busy, it could be much longer, right?
Yes. Or
But-
if they go to the wrong location.
Yeah, or they go to the wrong
Yes.
location, right? That happens sometimes.
Yes, that's happened to me.
So part of the analysis that a reasonable police officer is making is, I got EMS coming, right? How long should I expect them to be here? How long, they're considering that. They're taking that into their analysis.
Yes, they should.
Now, at the point that they stepped up the analysis, or stepped up EMS to code 3, would you agree that that's about the time that people began to congregate?
I would have to look at the video again, but yes, that's probably around the same time.
Right. So if EMS was stepped up at 2021, 8:21 and 35 seconds, it's about 90 seconds after the initial call, and Miss Frazier is seen coming into the area at 2021 and roughly 17 seconds, it's about the same period of time, right?
Is
Same
Ms. Frazier
the bystander with the video.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So she's the bystander who started recording,
Okay.
right? So she started recording at about this same time, right?
Yes.
And she was concerned about what she saw, agreed?
Yes.
And again, based on your review of all of the body cameras, Miss Frazier, she wasn't saying anything initially, right?
I don't believe she was, no.
She was simply there recording,
Yes.
right? She was not in any way interfering with what the police were doing, right?
Right.
But more people started coming together,
Yes.
right? And there was another gentleman that was there before, actually, as they were attempting to put him into the car, right?
The older gentleman, yes.
The older gentleman. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, do you participate in a training or present a training or have anything to do with a training called Awful But Lawful, or Lawful But Awful, something like that?
Yes.
And so you would agree the general concept is sometimes the use of force, it looks really bad, right?
Yes.
And sometimes it may be caught on video, right? And it
Yes.
looks bad, right?
Yes.
But it's still lawful.
Yes, based on that department's policies or based on that state's law. That was the whole premise. I did a presentation at a conference for that.
Okay. So the police use of force has a tendency at times to attract observers, right?
Yes.
And in the course of your career, I'm assuming at the very beginning of your career, not every single person was walking around with a video camera 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with it in their hand, right?
No, but in Los Angeles, it was right after Rodney King, so you did have people walking around with video cameras. There was actually one gentleman that actually was known for doing it.
Right. And so it's become, in the more recent history, as the smartphone has become as prevalent as it is, a more common experience. It's not just one guy driving around looking for cops arresting
Correct.
people. Any single person could be a potential videographer of a police interaction, right?
Yes, it's become pretty common practice.
And in fact, officers themselves now wear cameras, right?
Yes, most.
And in the city of Minneapolis, every uniformed police officer wears a body-worn camera, or they're supposed to, right?
Yes.
And those cameras are supposed to be running when they have interactions with citizens, peaceful or not peaceful, right?
Yes.
There's a limitation to cameras, though, right?
Yes, there is.
The camera only sees what the camera sees, right?
In certain instances, yes.
Meaning anything outside of its field of view is not observable to the camera.
Correct.
And certainly the certainly cameras they don't have a feeling or a sensation, right?
No.
You can't determine what the tension in their body, right, based on a camera.
Specifically, are you
If
referring
someone is struggling, right, and you've got them handcuffed, they can still be tense, but not really look very tense, right?
I would disagree with that.
Okay. So the camera would be able to pick up whether someone is having a particular sensory experience?
Yes, it can.
Okay.
Counsel, Cyber. We're going to take our 20-minute break. Please be ready to go at 11:05. Thank you. Still in roll.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sergeant Steiger, where we left off, I think we were talking about how bystanders began to congregate around the event, right?
I believe so, yes.
And you would agree that over the course of time, some of the bystanders who were observing the event became more excited.
More concerned, I would phrase it.
Their voices grew louder.
Yes.
They began name calling, essentially.
Correct.
And as that increased, or as the time went on, the intensity of the crowd increased.
Yes, they became more concerned.
Now, we looked at, I'm going to talk about Exhibit 110, if we could publish 110. So this again being what some people would call the use of force continuum, or what the Minneapolis Police Department calls the Defense and Control Response Training Guide, correct?
Yes.
Essentially, this is a graphic illustration in terms of, based upon the subject's behavior, how much force is authorized, correct?
Correct.
The onus or the focus being on the suspect's behavior initially, correct?
Correct.
And the response to that behavior, right?
Correct.
Now, again, we don't look at a use of force in a vacuum, right?
No, we did not.
We don't look at it, in singular frames, right?
Correct.
We look at the totality of the circumstances, right?
Yes.
And an officer, a reasonable officer, would take into consideration what has happened with the suspect a few minutes ago, correct?
Correct.
And try to use that information to inform what could potentially happen in the future. Agreed?
Agreed.
That's what reasonable officers do.
Yes.
So if I'm a police officer and me and my two partners just 2 minutes ago were fighting with someone, right? And our efforts became futile, right? That's going to affect how we perceive might happen in the future with that, what we perceive might happen in the future with that person.
It's something to be concerned about, correct?
Right. Because, in fact, oftentimes people who become compliant after a struggle start to struggle again, right?
In certain instances, yes.
It happens, right?
Yes, it does.
Someone who said, almost to like catch their wind again, right? And start fighting again, right?
In certain instances, yes, but in most cases, officers are trained that you can only go by what the suspect's actions are at the time. You can't say, oh, well, I thought he or she was going to do this, so then I'm going to use this force. Okay. It has to be based on their actions.
An officer's use of force can exceed the suspect's use of force, right?
The suspect's actions.
Behaviors, right?
Yes.
That's the design, correct?
In certain instances, yes. It has to be proportional.
Right. Meaning this concept of proportionality. If I call you a name, if I call you a name and you're a police officer, you can't pull your gun out and shoot me, right?
Correct.
That would be a disproportionate use of force to the threat I
perceived, yes.
Right. And so the mere fact that force is being applied, it's not second by second. We have to look at it in a longer context, right?
Yes, but you are constantly reassessing during that time frame.
Constantly reassessing. Now, I presume you've gone through firearms training.
Yes.
And I presume that you have had situations where you, in your firearms training, are confronted with multiple threats, right?
Yes.
And your training teaches you to deal with the most active threat, right?
Correct. Or the closest threat.
The closest threat or the biggest threat,
Correct.
right? And so you want to neutralize or contend with that potential threat before you deal with the lesser threats.
Yes.
right? And again, in this, this cycle, the critical decision-making model, that's coming both in terms of what you're dealing with in the suspect, right? That critical decision-making model is occurring.
Yes.
It's dealing with what's around you and what you're observing around you,
Your
right?
environment. Yes.
It's dealing with other people that may be there, right?
Yes.
And it's dealing with using that same model to take all of your training and experience and things of that nature too, right?
Correct.
So there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions being made every nanosecond almost, right?
In certain instances, yes.
And simply because a person is not fighting with you, right? If I'm not fighting with you, that doesn't mean you still can't use some sort of force to control me, right?
It depends on the circumstance.
According to the Minneapolis Police Department, if someone is passively resisting you, that means they're not fighting with you, right?
Correct.
Force can still be used, right?
Yes, in certain instances.
Right.
Depending on, again, the suspect's actions.
Again, including joint manipulation, pressure points, escort holds, or what we would call just a restraint, right?
Yes, and again, a lot of that depends on what the police response should be at that time. If it's where the officers decided that this person needs to go to jail, they're going to take them into custody, then those would come into play. If it's just more of a, hey, can we talk to you, or detaining them, then it may just be verbalization. So it just depends on the circumstances.
And obviously, if we want to protect that person, and we know that EMS is on its way, we can continue to restrain that person for EMS if they have a medical need for EMS, right?
It depends on the circumstance.
And ultimately, it's dependent upon the reasonable officer analysis, right?
Yes. And what's expected from that specific agency, what their expectations are of the officer's performance, as well as best practices as well. Those are taken into consideration.
And ultimately, under the Graham versus Connor analysis, it's the specific facts of the specific case. Agreed? What the officer is seeing at the scene, right?
Yeah, when we're talking about force, correct.
Yep. All right. Now, again, you've had an opportunity to review a lot of the Minneapolis Police Department's training materials,
Yes, sir.
some of which you found useful and some of which you didn't, right?
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that your review of those materials were more focused on defensive tactics, use of force training, and policies and things of that nature?
Correct.
And so I'm presuming that the more recent materials would be more illustrative or informative to you, informing your opinions, right?
Yes, based on what was current at the time of the incident.
Right. And you have seen the workforce director, the list of the programs that Officer Chauvin took?
Yes.
And you're familiar that Officer Chauvin, according to those records, took Phase 1 defensive tactics in the year 2020, March of 2020.
Yes, I believe so.
Did you review Phase 1 defensive tactics training materials for March of 2020?
I believe I did, yes.
If we could take this down, Your Honor. And just showing the witness. Can you see what's in front of you, sir?
Yes.
You'd agree that this appears to be the training materials for the 2020 in-service Phase 1 that would have been seen by Officer Chauvin?
Yes.
And
That
if
was
we-
one slide, yes.
And if we just look at the presentation, this is a presentation that largely deals with demonstrations, protests, crowd control, right?
Yes.
Large crowds, small crowds, things of that nature, right?
Yes.
This would have been training that Mr. Chauvin had roughly a month or two before this incident, right?
Correct.
Does this appear to be a true and accurate copy of what you would have reviewed?
Yes.
I have previously marked this as Exhibit 1032, and I would move for its admission.
Is this the single slide, council?
The entire program.
All right. Any objection?
Yes, Your Honor. Foundation.
Bates is $29.71 to 21096. It's the 2020 use of force in service. Large crowd management overview.
And your objection continues?
It does, Your Honor. We just have one moment.
Yeah.
No objection.
I'm sorry, no objection?
No objection.
All right. 1032 is received.
I'm showing you what I believe is slide 39 of this, and I'd ask permission to publish. This is the Minneapolis Police Department training materials on dealing with crowds, right?
With large crowds.
Large
yes.
crowds. Crowds, officers are trained, crowds are dynamic creatures and can change rapidly, right?
Yes.
You would agree with that?
And this particular training for large crowds, correct.
But even in small crowds, even if you have 10 people or 12 people, crowds are dynamic creatures, right?
In certain instances, yes.
And they can change very suddenly, right?
Yes.
Just a second, Your Honor. If we could take that. Oh, this is all. And I agree that this deals with larger crowds and larger protests.
Yeah, the training is specifically for mobile field force. I'm an instructor for mobile field force as well, so yeah, I'm familiar with
Right.
similar training.
Yep. And again, officers, they are experiencing this training, right?
Yes,
And they're taught never underestimate a crowd's potential, right?
correct.
And again, crowds being unique to the particular circumstances of a particular case, right?
Correct.
And so ultimately, when an officer is on scene and he's making a decision to use force, and a crowd assembles, whether they're peaceful or not peaceful, an officer, a reasonable officer, has to be aware of what they're doing, right?
Absolutely.
And that can distract an officer.
In certain instances, yes.
And as people start trying to communicate to the officers, that can take their, whether it's, even if it's just peaceful, hey officer, hey Sergeant Steiger, let's talk. That's distracting that officer from what he or she is doing, right?
Yes,
Right?
it can.
It can. And an officer has to be prepared for the unexpected. A reasonable officer does, right?
Yes, they're always mitigating the risk.
And I understand that part of what an officer has to do is assess the words someone may be saying and comparing it to the tone of how they're saying it, right?
Yes.
That's what a
Yes.
reasonable officer does, right?
Yes.
If I say, hello, Sergeant Steiger, versus, hello, Sergeant Steiger, right? There's two different tones, and my tone can convey meaning.
Yes.
Agreed? And if I start calling you names, that conveys a meaning, right?
Yes.
And saying things like, you're a fucking pussy, you're a bitch, that conveys a particular intent. Agreed?
I wouldn't say an intent, no.
And a reasonable officer could foresee that or see that, perceive that as a threat.
Name calling, I would say it depends on the officer's training and experience.
Okay. But an officer, a reasonable officer, could perceive the words that people are saying and the tone that it is being said in as a threat or a risk to the officer's safety. Agreed?
A risk, possibly, but officers are typically trained that when it comes to verbal threats in and themselves, that you can't just use that only to justify force.
Now, you've had, again, an opportunity to review Minneapolis Police Department's training materials. Oh, if we could take this down. Sorry. Can you see what's in front of you, sir?
Yes.
You reviewed, I presume, as a part of your analysis, the Minneapolis Police Department's crisis intervention technique training, right?
Yes.
And I'm not seeking to admit this, but officers are trained to look at potential signs of aggression, right?
Yes.
The Minneapolis Police Department trains its police officers how to potentially perceive an aggressive behavior of a person, right?
Correct.
And that includes raising voices, right?
Yes.
That includes people tensing muscles, right?
Yes.
Exaggerated gestures, pacing, right? That can be a sign of an aggressive behavior. Right?
Yes. Typically, those are when you're dealing with you're one-on-one with a specific subject or engaged in a specific call for service. That's
Right.
typically when the training is given is for that, when it's more of a one-on-one, when you're dealing with a subject one-on-one.
That's the training. But in terms of now you are an officer and you're engaged with the suspect, right? And somebody else is now pacing around and watching you and calling you names and saying you're a fucking pussy. This could be viewed by a reasonable officer as a threat.
As a potential threat, correct.
And in fact, when that happens, if you look at the slide in front of you, when how a person is talking to an officer, if they're mimicking them or rageful, officers are specifically trained to try to predict future behavior based on that, correct?
Yes, to prepare themselves.
Right. And when someone starts threatening you, it's a possibility that an officer can view that as a potential deadly assault is about to happen. That's what they're trained.
Yes, that's what they're trained. It says what is the person's likely behavior.
Now, you testified that, did you listen to every single thing that the crowd or the people were saying?
I attempted to, yes.
Right.
Some of it you can't make out, but yes, for the most part, yes.
And you would agree that if someone were to say, if you touch me like that, I would like to slap the fuck out of you, right? That could be viewed as a threat.
Yes.
Reasonable police officers need to have a higher level of awareness of a situation, don't they?
Yes.
And a reasonable police officer, you would want a reasonable police officer to be more situationally aware of everything that's happening around him or her than an average bystander, right? You'd
Yes.
expect that.
Usually that comes with training, experience, and tenure.
Now, there were some questions about the actual force that was applied in this case, and it's your professional opinion, is it not, that this appears to have Officer Chauvin's knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd, right?
Yes.
And that you concluded that that was a deadly use of force, right?
Yes, based on the Mr. Floyd's actions or lack of action.
So in that context, you believe A, the knee was on the neck and applying pressure to the carotid artery?
Not necessarily in the carotid artery, but it was in the neck area and on the back.
And so, as a police officer, you're trained in prone handcuffing, correct?
Correct.
You're trained in ground defense, correct?
Yes.
And ground defense includes the prone restraint technique, right?
Yes, I mean, there's other terms for it, but yes.
What would you call that? The prone restraint technique.
Well, it depends on in what context you mean.
Right. So the prone control technique, is that a
Yes.
specific term you're familiar with?
Control on a person.
Right. You've heard the phrase
To
control
attempt
the
to handcuffing.
Let's not talk over each other.
Sorry, sir.
Wait for the next question.
Yes, sir.
You've heard the phrase control the head, control the body.
Yes.
That's commonly what police officers are trained, right?
Yes, when it comes to handcuffing, correct.
And in ground defense, right?
Yes.
And in the context of ground defense or in handcuffing or continuing to restrain a police or a suspect, control the head, control the body, right?
Yes, when they are resisting.
And these concepts are widely accepted throughout law enforcement in the United States.
Yes.
And so again, in the training materials you've reviewed, you can see there are photographs, correct?
Correct.
Of officers employing a knee to the head, right?
I didn't see officer employing a knee to the head, no.
Sometimes to the neck.
Near the neck area, correct, yes.
And the specific technique that you're trained is for an officer to put his knee into what would be the trapezius area, in between the shoulder blades at the base of the neck.
Yes,
right?
the base of the neck.
And that is standard protocol, standard police practice, and basically in every single department that you're familiar with.
That I'm familiar with, yes.
And you were trained that way.
Yes.
And there's the immediacy of the handcuffing, correct?
Correct.
And then there's the need to continue to control the suspect, correct? If they're resisting.
Yes.
And then there is simply holding someone or restraining them to decide what your next steps are going to be, right?
Yes, in most cases, however, especially in the last 20 years, officers are trained to, once you handcuff the person, even if they are still resisting, you still want to try to put them in a somewhat of a side recovery position or sit them up.
Even if they're still resisting.
Yes. And hold them down in the side recovery position. Or utilize a hobble.
You would agree that the Minneapolis Police Department are trained that when a person is handcuffed and then rendered unconscious, that officers need to use caution in unhandcuffing them to revive them?
No, I'm not familiar with that. No.
Did you, as a part of your analysis, review any training materials regarding the use of the lateral vascular neck restraint?
Yes.
Just looking in front of you, did you look at this training material?
Yes.
Officers are trained that if CPR is needed, to remove handcuffs first, right?
Correct.
And to use caution because the subject may revive agitated and ready to fight.
Correct.
You've had that training too?
Yes.
You've had that experience where someone is rendered unconscious, is revived, and fights you more?
Not that they passed out and then they came to, yes.
And then they fought you more?
Yes.
Looking at what's already in evidence, the 2019 use of force manual at slide 41. This is what we're talking about in terms of the prone arm control, right?
Yes.
And you see a photograph here. Officer's knee appears to be across into the shoulder blades and between the shoulder blades across the head and neck area of the person, right?
Yes, as he's attempting to handcuff the person, yes.
Your Honor, not an objection, but just a pause. Would you please identify?
That was, I have it listed as 1031. Or that's what I had it. I don't remember what you were using.
That's the 2019.
Off the record.
2019 use of force.
You say 1041.
Sorry. I'm referring to bait stamp 21464 was the 2019 defensive tactics that you introduced. Sorry. Your Honor, this is from Exhibit 126, which is already in evidence. I'd ask for permission to publish. Again, you see here, this officer's knee appears to be over the neck and head of the subject as he's attempting to handcuff him, correct?
Correct.
And so there are circumstances when the knee is put in this position, correct?
Yes, but officers are always cautioned to try to stay away from the neck as much as possible.
All right. We can take that down, Your Honor. Now, you were shown a series of photographs, the comparative photographs, and I just don't have a copy of that right now. I believe it was Exhibit 274, the one you just admitted. I don't have that yet. There was a one photo. Would it be possible to publish that? The photo, if we could publish this exhibit in this upper right-hand corner, right?
Yes.
Mr. Chauvin, the right shoulder is down lower, right, than the left shoulder.
Yes.
And that would be consistent with more of his weight being on his right side, correct?
Yes.
We can take that down. And again, when we look at still photographs, what we miss is sort of the dynamics of what's happening, right?
Yes.
So weight can be shifting from side to side at times,
Correct.
right? And if an officer is, generally speaking, on his toes, the majority of the weight is going to be in the feet, right? That's what you're trained?
Yes, that's how officers are trained.
And so if his left leg, his foot is off to the side, he has no weight, or he has less weight on that side of his body because his foot is off to the side, right?
Yes.
And if his right foot, the toes are tucked under, that would be consistent with having the majority of the weight on the right side, right?
Yes.
And again, in uses of force that you've used yourself, or in uses of force that you have reviewed, right? Oftentimes, these things, uses of force, leave injuries on a suspect, right?
Yes.
And if the weight of a human being was placed in a particular area based on your training and experience at reviewing police uses of force, you would expect there to be injury where the majority of the weight exists, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation beyond scope.
Overruled. You may answer.
Not necessarily, no.
Okay. But obviously, medical doctors may be able to answer that better, right?
Correct.
You would agree that on May 25th of 2020, Minneapolis Police Department authorized the use of neck restraints, right?
Correct.
And that the conscious neck restraint was not considered a lethal use of force.
Correct.
So I would like to show you a series of photographs that were introduced yesterday, starting with Exhibit 1045. So before we go there, you would agree that some of the problems with photographs are that, again, it doesn't capture, a single photograph isn't going to capture the dynamics of what's happening, right?
In some cases, yes.
Weight can shift, right?
Correct.
In a video versus a still photograph, right?
Yes.
And positions can change, right?
Yes.
And those things can happen throughout the course of the time of use of force, right?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to show you and publish Exhibit 1045. I don't know if you've seen these, but these are stills from the body-worn camera. Oh, sorry, I gotta switch. It's a little difficult to see through the glare here, but maybe you can see it better on your screen.
And if you have to stand up to see past
The glare, feel free.
Thank you, sir.
In this area here, it appears that you can see Officer Chauvin's left leg,
Yes.
and that Officer Chauvin's shin appears to be sort of parallel to or over Mr. Floyd's left shoulder blade. Agreed?
It's hard to tell. It could be his neck or shoulder blade.
In this dip right in here, the area between the two shoulder blades, he's handcuffed, right? That causes the shoulders to sort of come back.
I'm sorry, you're referring to his left knee, correct? That's
Right.
what you stated, that his left knee?
Right.
Yes, his left knee appears to be, based on the photograph I'm looking at, near the neck area of Mr. Floyd.
In between the shoulder blade here and what would be the shoulder blade behind his hand.
Above it. I wouldn't say it was in between it. It's more, it looks like it appears to be more above the shoulder blades than it does on the shoulder blades or below it.
Almost resting on the shoulder blade.
Above, I would
You would say
call
it's
it above, yes.
All right. But it appears to be angled in towards the cruiser, correct?
Yes.
Now, showing you, oops, I'm going to display that again. That being at 20/23/32, right?
Yes.
Again, you can see Mr. Floyd's shoulder blade here a little bit more pronounced.
Yes.
It appears to be above the shoulder blade, correct? Mr. Chauvin's, Mr. Floyd's shoulder blade is a little more pronounced. Mr. Chauvin's shin appears to be, or calf, appears to be above the shoulder blade,
Correct.
angled in towards the squad car, correct?
Slightly, yes.
Showing you 1047. This is now at 2027. Appears to be a different angle now, right?
Yes.
And you can get a much clearer view of the placement of Mr. Chauvin's knee.
Yes.
And again, here you've got the shoulder blade shoulder blade, Mr. Chauvin's knee is sort of at the base of the neck, right?
Correct, I would agree.
And looking finally at Exhibit 1048. You can see Mr. Floyd's head in this picture, correct?
Yes,
And it gives you, again, a depth perception of the placement of Mr. Chauvin's knee relative to the neck of Mr. Floyd.
somewhat, yes.
Now, if we could take this down, Your Honor. I'd like to show you what has been introduced into evidence as Exhibit 1020, which on the left-hand side of your screen, you see that appears to be the bystander video.
Yes,
On the right-hand side, that's from Mr. King's body-worn camera.
yes.
You'd agree that at this point, based on everything that we've seen in the same photographs, on the left-hand side, it appears that Mr. Chauvin's knee is on Mr. Floyd's neck.
Yes. More of the base of the neck.
And from Officer King's body-worn camera, it appears that it was more at the base of the neck, in between the shoulder blades, right?
Yes.
And in fact, as you review some of the videos, while Mr. Floyd was in the prone position, there are points in time at which Mr. Floyd picks up his head and moves it. Agreed?
He attempted to early on, yes. He was stating he couldn't breathe, so I assumed he was attempting to try to breathe better.
But he was able to lift up his head at some points, turn it. Correct?
Slightly, yes. He attempted to.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, to clarify a little bit on the, thank you. To clarify a little bit on the known risk that you testified to with respect to positional asphyxia.
Yes.
Okay. Is the risk related to the pressure on the neck or the pressure on the body?
This the pressure on the body. Any additional pressure on the body complicates breathing more so than if there was no pressure at all.
And so the placement of the knees, even if there can be shifting between the neck, the base of the neck, the point is that both of the defendant's knees were on Mr. Floyd's body during the entirety of the restraint period. Is that right?
Yes.
I want to ask you some questions about what may have been apparent to the defendant when he first got on the scene. You were asked some questions about being dispatched, and you know the term Code 4, correct?
Correct.
And were you aware that prior to the defendant arriving on the scene that Officer Lane had called Code 4?
Yes, I believe so. In reviewing some of the documentation and things of that nature.
And what does that mean?
That means that everything is okay, that we have the suspect in custody.
So at least at the time the defendant arrived, he would have been aware, based on the totality, that Code 4 had been called.
Yes.
I'd like to direct your attention to the moment in time when he would have arrived. You can pull Exhibit 43 which is, for the record, Officer Lane's body-worn camera. And I'd like you to begin displaying at timestamp 2017:20. I'm sorry, can't hear you. Hold on. Apologize. 47. And if- All right. Well, we see it at, you can leave it at 20 or where it was. Yep, go ahead. All right, so we see in the still frame, and now for the record, the timestamp is 2017:20. At this point in time, we see Officer Tao, and would have been next to him, the defendant, arrive. Is that right?
Yes, I believe you can see his shoulder and the circle that you have.
And I'd ask to begin publishing to the jury.
I'm not trying to win. I'm not trying to win. I get on the ground, anything. I can't stand this shit, man. He know it. He know it. Okay, can I talk to you, please?
As you get in this car, we can talk.
I'm claustrophobic.
I'm hearing you, but you're not working with me.
God, I'm claustrophobic, man.
Get in the
I'll have
car.
your phone over here. I'm going to pull you in.
Get in the
Can you
car.
put me in the front? Please.
No, you're not getting in the
I'm
front.
claustrophobic, Mr. Officer.
Get in the car.
Okay, man, okay. I'm not a bad guy, man.
Get in the car.
I'm not a bad guy. Oh, God. Man. Oh.
Now, and you can take that down. Sir, in assessing an individual in the totality of the circumstances that would have been apparent at the scene, were you able to detect any indication that Mr. Floyd was under some sort of distress?
Based on his comments and based on his actions, yes, it was a possibility.
And is that something that would have, apparently Officer Chauvin, the defendant, would have seen that? Is that correct?
Yes.
And would a reasonable officer have taken that into account?
Yes.
Now, sir, you testified that the force that was used here during the restraint period by the defendant was in fact excessive. Is that right?
Yes.
And you were asked on cross to distinguish between the standard, or to comment on the standard of objectively reasonable force. Is it your opinion then, to a degree of professional certainty, that the force that you've identified as applied by the defendant during the restraint period, was it objectively reasonable or not objectively reasonable?
It was not objectively reasonable.
And is that then the basis for saying it was excessive?
Correct.
You were asked about different techniques for de-escalation and the telling of someone to relax. I'd like you to comment on the context in which Mr. Floyd was told to relax by the defendant.
It appeared in the video that he was told to relax, as he was stating that he was in a medical distress, he couldn't breathe, and that he was in pain.
And so, again, the context, the words of the defendant versus the actions, telling someone to relax when you're sitting on top of them, is that an effective de-escalation technique in your opinion?
Overruled. Opinion.
Not necessarily.
As to an officer, a reasonable officer, reassessing and reevaluating the situation, they also have to take in information related to a subject's potential medical condition. Is that right?
Yes.
Would you agree with the statement, in your custody, in your care?
Yes. I
What
do
does
agree.
that mean?
That means once you take someone into custody, then you're responsible for their care.
And can you, as an officer, simply opt not to believe them?
No,
You have to consider the context, correct?
correct.
And
We're obligated to in most cases.
I'm sorry, I cut you off. Could you please repeat that?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. You're obligated to. It's part of your duty.
And in the context that you saw here, in which Mr. Floyd was manifesting some distress, did you believe the defendant have an obligation to at least take that into consideration in the totality of circumstances when considering to continue the type of force he was applying?
Absolutely. As the time went on, clearly in the video you could see that Mr. Floyd's his health was deteriorating. His breath was getting lower, his tone of voice was getting lower, his movements were starting to cease. So at that point, as a officer on scene, you have a responsibility to realize that, okay, something is not right, something has changed drastically from what was occurring earlier, so therefore you have a responsibility to take some type of action.
Sir, you were shown some training materials that included photographs of officers in positions in which they would have their legs on the subject's back and the base of the neck. Is that right?
Yes.
And in the photograph you were shown, that subject was not yet handcuffed, was he?
No, he was not.
And the purpose of situating oneself on a subject is to gain control in order to handcuff the individual.
Yes.
And what is the officer supposed to do after they handcuff the individual?
Immediately sit the person up or put him on the side recovery position.
You were asked to comment on sort of the notion that some things that law enforcement do, or have to do, uses of force, are not attractive to the public. Is that right?
Correct.
And in fact, you were asked about a presentation that you had given relative to that called, was it Awful but Lawful?
Yes.
And to be lawful, the force must be objectively reasonable, correct?
Correct.
And if it isn't lawful, then what's left?
Well, the whole premise of the presentation was that in certain situations, based on a policy or a particular law, even though the situation may be deemed lawful in the community's eyes, in the use of force is awful. So it was stating that, hey, in these situations, you can have a situation where by law it looks horrible to the common eye, but based on the state law, it's lawful.
But if it's not objectively reasonable and it's not lawful, then it's just awful.
Correct.
Any response?
You were not personally there that day, correct?
The day of this incident? Correct.
Correct. And you would not have known how people were feeling, correct?
Correct.
You would not know how they felt in terms of their perception, correct?
Correct.
You would not know how Mr. Floyd's body felt at that moment, correct?
Only what he was verbalizing.
I'm talking about in terms of the stiffness or tension of his body.
Correct.
And again, in terms of your use of force reviews in the past, you said you're a peer reviewer. How many reviewers look at an incident in the terms of a use of force?
From start to finish? Numerous. So in Los Angeles Police Department, it starts with the sergeant who's doing the investigation. Then from there, it will go to the watch commander, who happens to be typically a lieutenant or another sergeant, and the training coordinator. Then they make recommendations, and then they send it to the captains of the division. And at that point, the captains would then send it to the bureau. and that's where I was at one point as well. Then the Bureau makes recommendations, and then it gets sent up to another unit, and they make the final recommendation in that. In regards to more serious ones where I was a peer member, it goes from the investigators to the Use of Force Review Board, which is a 5-member board, 4 command staff and a peer.
And that peer review board, the 5 people, they make recommendations to move up the chain, right?
Yes, so they make recommendations. I'm sorry.
No, I was itching my face.
They make recommendations to the chief of police. Then the chief of police reviews it, and he makes recommendations to the police commission. And the inspector general's office also reviews all the evidence as well, and they make recommendations. In most cases, they concur with the chief, but some cases they disagree. And then finally, a presentation is made to the police commission, and the police commission at that point makes the final decision.
So there's layers of review, right?
Correct.
And ultimately, in terms of just that 5-member review board, right, the one that you were describing,
Right.
Are those decisions always unanimous
No.
as to whether or not it was a reasonable use of force?
No, it's not.
And sometimes those 5 people, they may disagree with each other, right?
Yes, we have a something what we call a minority report. I've actually written a couple of those myself. But yes, if one person or a number of people on that board will disagree, then that the ones that disagree, the minority, have to do a report, basically telling what their case is or why they disagree.
Right. So even within that process, there is 5 potential police officers who can disagree with each other.
Correct.
All right. I have no further questions.
All right, thank you, Sergeant.
Thank you, sir.
We appreciate your time. You are excused.
Thank you.
Let's do one more witness, at least start.
Your Honor, the state would call Special Agent James Ryerson to the stand.
Could you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Let's see, please. And if you feel comfortable doing so, take off your mask. Let's start with you giving your full name, spelling each of your names.
James, James, Ryerson, Reyerson.
Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you tell us what your current occupation is?
I'm currently a senior special agent with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
So just in general, what does a senior special agent do? What does your job entail?
So I'm currently assigned to the newly formed Use of Force investigation group. We conduct criminal investigations into uses of force incidents.
Are you a licensed peace officer?
Yes, sir.
Obviously, you're not wearing what we typically think of as a police uniform. Is that, well, when you work, do you have a uniform?
Generally, no. We're generally plain clothes.
Okay. And you mentioned, well, when did you first become licensed as a peace officer?
I started my law enforcement career in 2007.
And so let's run through your education and work experience for your job as a peace officer. First of all, did you obtain a 4-year undergraduate degree?
I did.
Can you describe or tell the jury what that is?
I have a Bachelor's of Science in Criminology from the University of Tampa.
What year did you achieve that?
In 2006.
And after that, did you go to work in the field of law enforcement?
I did.
Where were you first hired to work in law enforcement?
I started my career at the New York City Police Department, the NYPD.
And so did you do some training then to be an NYPD officer?
I did. The NYPD has a 6-month training academy that I successfully completed.
And is that when you then obtained your license to be a peace officer?
Yes, sir.
And that was about what year?
Approximately 2007.
And when you became, well, let me ask you this. How many years did you work for the NYPD?
Approximately 4.5.
And can you describe for the jurors in what capacity you worked as a peace officer in New York City.
So as a police officer, initially assigned to the 32nd Precinct in Harlem, New York, my initial duties were as an impact officer, interacting with the community, addressing kind of quality of life issues. I was then transferred to Manhattan North Task Force as a task force officer. From there, I was assigned to address quality of life issues as well as violent crime issues, narcotics, and guns.
So all that time spent on the streets, essentially.
Correct.
And at some point, did you leave the New York City Police Department?
I did.
And what was the next job that you took in law enforcement?
I was hired as a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA.
And what year was that?
It was approximately 2011.
And what were your duties as a DEA agent?
Primarily to address large-scale, long-term investigations into narcotics.
Into what?
Narcotics,
Got it.
drugs.
And you had to do some training for that job, I assume?
Correct, yes, sir.
And how long was the training for that job?
Approximately 4.5 months at Quantico, Virginia.
And what kind of, well, after doing the training, were you assigned to a specific location?
I was, sir, yes.
And where were you assigned?
Initially to an enforcement group in New York City, and then I was transferred down to Nogales, Arizona, where my primary responsibility was investigating cartel activity.
And when you say cartel, we're talking drug cartel.
Correct, sir.
And at some point then did you leave the DEA?
Yes,
And what year was that?
around 2013,
Why?
to move back to Minnesota.
And when you moved, well, when you say back to Minnesota, had you been here before?
Yes, this is where I'm from.
So when you went to the New York City Police Department, that was a change of locations for you.
It was, yes, sir.
So about 2013, you said you came back to Minnesota?
Correct.
And did you find work in a related law enforcement field?
Yes, sir.
Describe that for the jurors, please.
I went into corporate investigations, focused on insurance, white-collar based kind of work.
And during that time period, did you complete some more education?
I did, yes, sir.
And tell the jurors what that was.
I received my master's in business administration from Southern New Hampshire,
What year was that?
approximately 2014.
And at some point, did you leave that corporate investigative work?
Yes, sir.
Where'd you go from there?
I went to the Metro Transit Police Department
That's here in
here
Minnesota.
in Minneapolis.
And how long did you work there?
Very short time.
Okay. Where'd you go from there?
I was hired by the State of Minnesota Fraud Bureau as a special agent.
So is that part of the state government?
Correct.
What agency is that?
Department of Commerce.
When you worked at the Department of Commerce, were you a licensed peace officer?
Yes, sir.
Probably a lot of people don't know that there are licensed peace officers in the Department of Commerce, right?
Yes, sir.
What kinds of investigations did you do at the Department of Commerce?
Primarily white-collar investigations.
And at some point, did you leave the Department of Commerce then?
Yes, sir.
And where did you go after that?
The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
And when were you hired by the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension?
2018.
And that's where you are today still?
Correct, sir.
So initially licensed in 2007.
Yes, sir.
Did you maintain your license as a peace officer during that entire time period?
No.
When?
From about middle of 2013 to 2016, I was not.
And that's when you were working.
From the middle of 2013, sir, to about 2016, I was not.
And that's when you were doing the corporate work?
Correct.
As a licensed peace officer, you are required to take some ongoing educational credits, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you've done all that throughout your career, with the exception of that 2-year period.
Yes, sir.
When you were hired at the BCA in 2018, what were you hired to do?
I was hired within the Metro Homicide Unit, so we investigated major homicides as well as officer-involved incidents.
When you're hired at the BCA, are you required to go through some training specific to working for the BCA?
Yes, sir.
Can you describe for the jurors the kind of training that you had to do when you started with the BCA?
There's training that's involved with writing search warrants, report writing, as well as some tactics, interview and interrogation as well.
And do you also have to spend some time at the medical examiner's office?
Yes, sir.
Describe that for the jury, if you would.
I recently completed the forensic pathology program at the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's Office, where I was present with the medical examiners conducting autopsies.
And are you currently working on an additional educational goal?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell the jurors what that is?
I'm currently a third-year doctoral student at St. Mary's University of Minnesota, focused on education and leadership.
Now, you have told us that you work for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension,
Yes, sir.
commonly referred to as the BCA, correct?
Correct.
Can you describe for the juries, what is the BCA?
So the BCA is a state law enforcement agency. We are under the umbrella of Department of Public Safety, kind of delineated into 4 divisions. The investigative division that I'm a part of, we have information services, a laboratory, as well as a training section. And we provide services to law enforcement agencies as well as to the community.
And so your jurisdiction is generally where?
The state of Minnesota.
And on May 25th of 2020, what were your duties as a special agent?
So I'm currently the case agent and lead investigator for this investigation, so I was notified of the incident fairly quickly.
And you mentioned earlier about currently having a different assignment. Can you explain to the jury how your assignment has changed from May 25th of last year to today?
So back then I was in the Metro Homicide Unit, which investigated both homicides as well as officer-involved incidents. There's a newly formed Force Investigations Unit that I am now a part of that solely focuses on investigations involving use of force.
You mentioned earlier the term case agent.
Correct.
What does that mean?
Case agent is another term for the lead investigator on a particular case.
And obviously you're here today to testify about the incidents that led to the death of George Floyd last year, correct?
Correct.
And you were the case agent for that case?
Yes, sir.
And when you are the case agent, are you responsible for knowing the course of the investigation?
Yes, sir.
Being involved in all aspects of the investigation?
Somewhat, yes, sir.
And that runs from beginning to end?
Yes, sir.
So taking you back to May 25 of 2020, you got called out regarding this incident?
Yes, sir.
Can you just describe for the jurors how you get that initial call and what you do in response?
So my supervisor called me at approximately 9:45, Agent Phil, and informed me there had been an incident that occurred in the confines of Minneapolis involving Minneapolis Police Department. It was determined that myself, Agent Phil, and Agent Scott Mueller would all report to City Hall. So we met at City Hall, Minneapolis City Hall, and then it was determined that Agent Mike Phil would head to 38th in Chicago, the scene, and myself and Agent Scott Mueller would head into room 100 at Minneapolis City Hall.
And so did you understand essentially why you, as BC agents, were being called to this incident?
We knew that some form of critical incident had occurred, but at that point we didn't have a huge amount of information.
And when you use the term critical incident in this context, what did it mean to you at that time?
An incident involving a police officer and potentially a civilian that could have caused harm.
So on May 25th of 2020, was the BCA responding to calls of critical incidents within the city of Minneapolis?
Yes.
And so had you developed, that is the BCA, a process for responding to those calls?
Yes, we have critical incident protocols.
And when you arrived with the other agents at City Hall, that's where the administrative offices of the Minneapolis Police Department are, correct?
Correct.
And so then at some point, the decision is made for Mike Phil to go to the scene at 38th in Chicago.
Yes, sir.
And that you and Agent Mueller then wait around or stay at City Hall, correct?
Correct.
All right. And when you arrived there, did you I guess, give what we call a briefing about what was known so far?
Yes, sir.
And did you learn who the involved officers were?
We did, yes, sir.
And who were those officers that you learned at that time were involved?
Officer Derek Chauvin, Officer Alexander King, Officer Blaine, and Officer Tao.
And in the course of, well, I guess I should ask it this way. Did you then initiate the critical incident protocols for this incident?
I did, yes.
And as part of that, taking photographs of each officer?
Yes, sir.
And were those officers there at City Hall that evening?
Yes, sir.
I should ask you, I guess, you said you initially got the call about 9:45 p.m.?
Correct.
Do you recall about what time it was that you arrived at City Hall?
Approximately 30 to 40 minutes later.
And yeah, can we put this up just for the witness, please? I'm going to show you Exhibit 279. Do you recognize that photograph?
Yes, sir.
Did you, in fact, take that photograph?
Yes, sir.
When was that photograph? Well, does this appear to be a true and accurate representation of what you saw when you took that photograph that evening?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, I'd offer Exhibit 279.
Any objection? 279 is received.
I'd ask to publish it, Your Honor. And do you recall approximately when this was taken?
Shortly after I arrived at City Hall.
And through subsequent investigation that you've done, did you learn the approximate weight of the defendant around this time period?
Yes, sir.
And what was that weight?
Approximately 140 pounds.
Sorry.
140 pounds.
And as a police officer since, what, approximately 2007, right?
Yes, sir.
You're familiar with what I call the duty belt, the equipment that he's wearing?
Yes, sir.
Can you just describe for the jurors, general, what is present on his duty belt?
Initially, firearm, handcuffs, mace. Usually there's a radio holder and a radio associated with that as well, and multiple magazines.
The magazine is what?
The magazine holds the bullets for the firearm.
And any body armor that he is currently wearing?
Yes, it appears though he has a vest on.
Based on your experience as a peace officer, are you able to estimate the approximate weight of the equipment that the defendant is wearing in this photograph?
Approximately 30 to 40 pounds.
Okay, we can take that down. Thank you. Now, while you're there at City Hall, did you endeavor to collect some other items of evidence or for the investigation?
Yes, sir.
And what other items did you acquire?
Part of our critical incident protocols is acquiring the officers involved's uniform as well as their equipment, including their firearm.
And did you also acquire some videos?
Yes, sir.
And on May 25th of 2020, were you aware that Minneapolis police officers wear body cams?
Yes, sir.
And did you acquire then the body cam videos for the 4 involved officers?
Yes, sir.
And can you just describe for the jurors how that process is done?
The Minneapolis Police Department Crime Lab retains the actual physical body-worn camera, downloads it, and provides it then to the BCA, to me.
And so you acquired those 4 body cam videos?
Yes, sir.
In the course of the investigation, you've acquired some other videos as well.
Yes, sir.
With regard to the body cam videos of the 4 involved officers, you have watched all of those, have you?
Yes, sir.
Those have a time stamp on them, correct?
They do, yes, sir.
And in your review, do they appear to be consistent with each other in their time stamps?
Yes, sir.
While you were at City Hall, did you collect some other data about the incident?
Yes, sir. I collected a CAD report.
And can you describe for the jury what is a CAD report when you say that?
CAD report is a transcription of all the radio traffic associated with a specific incident.
Any other data then that you acquired there?
The milestone video.
What is that?
Milestone video is a video, city video that is positioned at the street level. at various places throughout the city.
And so you learned that there was a milestone video of the location of this incident,
Yes, sir.
and you obtained that.
Yes, sir.
How about any information about the 911 call or that traffic?
Yes, I also retained the audio file from the 911 call.
While you were there, at some point, did you learn about a Facebook video of the incident?
Yes, sir.
How did you learn about that?
Deputy Chief Eric Forrest notified me of a video that had surfaced on Facebook.
And were you able to watch that video at that time?
Yes, sir. I was shown the video shortly thereafter.
Do you recall if you watched the whole thing or parts of it?
I believe it was a portion of the video.
And throughout your investigation of this case, have you come to learn that who was the person making that video or filming that?
Darnella Frazier.
So after your duties at City Hall, did you proceed to the scene?
Yes, sir.
And when you arrived at the scene, were there other BCA individuals there?
Yes, sir.
Who all was there still at that point?
I met with Agent Mike Phil and crime scene team lead Mackenzie Anderson.
Do you recall about what time it was that you arrived at the scene?
Approximately 2 to 3 in the morning of the 26th.
And you mentioned the crime scene team. Can you just describe very generally for the jurors what you mean by the crime scene team?
Crime scene team is members of our BCA laboratory who go out and forensically collect evidence in support of criminal investigations.
So they investigate crimes at the scene.
Yeah, they collect and process crimes at the scene.
And who was the, well, let me ask you this way. How many members are there of the crime scene team typically?
Typically 2 to 3 and a special operations agent who is solely assigned to take video and photographs.
And so there is a team leader?
Correct.
And who was that for this case?
Mackenzie Anderson.
When you arrived at the scene, did you learn about some vehicles at the scene that were involved in the incident, supposedly?
Yes, sir.
And what were those vehicles? Can you describe them, please?
A I believe, blue in color Mercedes-Benz and a Minneapolis Police Squad Car 320.
And so when you say the Mercedes-Benz, do you know what style of vehicle that was?
I actually don't. It's an SUV.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was trying to get at, I guess. And so those two vehicles, did you see them at the scene?
Yes.
Do you recall where they were located?
I believe they were on the south side of 38th.
And with regard to the squad car, the Minneapolis Police Squad Car, did you learn anything about contents of that vehicle?
Yes.
What did you learn?
I learned that two $20 bills were in a manila envelope in the trunk area of the vehicle, as well as other items that related to this incident.
So what did you do with regard to that envelope?
I seized those at the scene, that envelope at the scene.
And so you, by seizing it, you took it with you.
Correct.
And did you open up that envelope and see what its contents were?
Initially, yes.
And so you mentioned $20 bills, correct?
Correct.
And, Your Honor, if I could show the witness only, please, Exhibit 198.
Sure.
Members of the jury, we're going to take our lunch break at this time. Let's try and reconvene at 1:15. And especially, you may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes.